My wife spent 6 years building something in those mountains that she swore I could never see. I thought it was grief. I thought it was madness. I thought maybe she just needed a place away from me. But 3 months after I buried her, a lawyer handed me an iron key and whispered, "She said you'd know what to do." I didn't. I had no idea. And the moment I stepped inside that lodge, I understood why she had forbidden me. The truth hidden in those walls almost killed me before the men who wanted it buried could finish the job. Thank you for being here with me. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I would really like to hear from you. This story carries themes meant to make you think and reflect. Some details are dramatized for storytelling purposes, and any similarities are purely coincidental. But the message may be worth considering. The kitchen floor was cold. That is the first thing I remember, not the taste of copper flooding my mouth, not the way my vision fractured into shards of yellow light, not even the frantic drumming of my own heart fighting a poison I had swallowed with my morning coffee. The cold. Slate tiles pressing against my cheek like the palm of a dead woman holding me down. Somewhere above me, a shadow filled the doorway. I knew that shape. I had held that shape as a newborn, had walked it down the aisle of a Nashville church. My daughter stood there watching the life drain from my face. She did not move, but I am getting ahead of myself. 3 months earlier, a city that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. The December light in my Nashville study was thin and apologetic, as though the sun knew it had no business illuminating a room so heavy with absence. I sat in the leather chair Dorothy had given me for our 30th anniversary, surrounded by the artifacts of a life I thought I understood. A scale model of the Saturn V rocket stood on the shelf by the window, its white paint yellowed with age. Framed blueprints from my NASA years lined the walls. Every system has a logic. Every structure has a purpose. Find the blueprint and you understand the machine. I had spent 31 years applying that principle to rocket engines. I never thought to apply it to my own wife. Russell Tate, 66 years old, retired propulsion engineer. A man who once calculated thrust vectors to keep astronauts alive, but who could not see the secret his wife built under the roof they shared. Dorothy had been gone 90 days, and the house still smelled like her. Lavender, darkroom chemicals, and the faint sweetness of birdseed she kept by the back door. She had been a wildlife photographer. Or so I believed, spending weeks in the field returning with memory cards full of warblers and hawks. I never questioned the trips. I was too busy grading papers at Vanderbilt and rebuilding a vintage telescope in the garage to notice that my wife's photography hobby apparently required a budget larger than my pension. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:15. I know the time, because I had been counting the seconds between the mantel clock's ticks, a grief habit no one warns you about. Patricia Langford stood on my porch. 58. Sharp posture. The kind of woman who had never wasted a minute. Dorothy's estate attorney for over a decade, though I had met her only twice. She carried a leather briefcase and a wooden box made of dark walnut, about the size of a hardcover novel, with a brass clasp that caught the winter light. "Mr. Tate," she said. Her voice carried the careful weight of a controlled detonation. Dorothy left explicit instructions. I was to deliver this exactly 90 days after her passing. Not 89, not 91. She placed the box on my desk with a reverence that tightened my stomach. She did not sit. She did not accept coffee. She simply watched me, the way a surgeon watches a patient before a diagnosis that changes everything. "The key opens the property," Pat continued. "The letter explains why. Read the entire letter before you make any decisions." Dorothy was very specific about that. Have you ever held an object that weighed almost nothing yet felt heavier than anything you have ever carried? I opened the clasp after she left. Inside, on dark velvet, lay an iron key. Not brass or chrome. Iron. Old, heavy, and cold, as if stored somewhere sunlight could not reach. Beside it, a sealed cream envelope, Dorothy's handwriting on the front. 2 words. My Russell. My hands were steady. An engineer's hands trained on components worth more than our house. But when I slid my thumb under the flap, something inside me already knew the blueprint I was about to read would dismantle every structure I had built my life upon. "My dearest Russell," the letter began, in her precise architectural script. "If you are reading this, the silence I kept for 6 years has finally served its purpose. I am sorry for every lie about where I was going and what I was building. But I forbade you from the lodge to protect you from a truth that would have put you in the crosshairs of a man who has no conscience and no limits." I stopped breathing. My eyes raced ahead, catching fragments. Conservation Trust. Irrevocable. 620 acres. Smoky Mountains. $1.8 million. $1.8 million. We argued over the price of new tires. We refinanced the mortgage twice for Wade's graduate school. Dorothy's photography income barely covered her equipment, or so she told me. Where did she find $1.8 million? The letter continued, and the final paragraph turned solid ground into smoke. "The property is yours now. It holds evidence of crimes that powerful men will kill to keep buried. You cannot sell it. The trust is irrevocable. You have 30 days to take legal possession. And Russell, hear this clearly. Do not trust the man who calls your daughter his wife. The man who calls your daughter his wife. Grant Mercer, my son-in-law. The man who stood beside me at Dorothy's funeral with his hand on my shoulder, murmuring practiced condolences. The man who carved our Thanksgiving turkey and helped my grandchildren with homework." Dorothy spent the last line of her final letter, turning him into a threat I could not ignore. I set the letter down. My hands were no longer steady. Through the study window, the Saturn V model caught the fading light, a monument to a career built on understanding complex systems. But the most complex system I had ever encountered was not a rocket engine. It was the woman who slept beside me for 31 years, while secretly constructing a fortress in the mountains and a case against the man who married our daughter. I looked at the iron key on its velvet bed. It was ancient and plain, and utterly without decoration. Dorothy had chosen it deliberately. She wanted me to feel the weight of what I was about to unlock. I turned the letter over, hoping for more. There was nothing on the back but a faint watermark and the ghost of Dorothy's perfume trapped in the fibers. But the envelope was not empty. Behind the letter, folded with the precision of a woman who understood that documents outlive the people who sign them, was a legal deed. I spread it across the desk, smoothing the creases with my palms. The paper was heavy, official, embossed with the seal of a county clerk's office in Sevier County, Tennessee, 620 acres. Located near Clingman's Dome in the Great Smoky Mountains, straddling the Tennessee and North Carolina border, zoned as conservation land. Purchased outright 6 years ago. Paid in full, $1.8 million. I read that number 3 times. Then I pulled out a calculator. Because that is what engineers do when the world stops making sense. Dorothy's annual photography income averaged $42,000 after expenses. My NASA pension and Vanderbilt salary together never exceeded $130,000. We lived comfortably, but modestly. We drove used cars. We packed lunches. The idea that Dorothy had quietly assembled $1.8 million without my knowledge was not just surprising. It was structurally impossible within the financial model I thought we shared. Unless the model itself was a lie. I flipped to the second page and found the trust structure. The property was held in an irrevocable conservation trust, meaning it could not be sold, subdivided, or developed under any circumstances. Dorothy had designed it as a legal fortress with walls no court could breach. But what stopped my hand mid-page was the exclusion list. Every trust has beneficiaries, and every trust has boundaries. Dorothy had drawn hers with a scalpel. At the top of the exclusion list, printed in bold, legal type, was a single name. Grant Mercer. Specifically excluded from any access, benefit, inheritance, or decision-making authority related to the property, its assets, or its revenues, in perpetuity. In perpetuity. That is a word that means forever. Dorothy had not merely kept Grant away from the lodge. She had built a legal wall designed to outlast both of them. I sat back. The chair creaked beneath me with a sound that felt too loud in the silent house. Grant Mercer, 44 years old. A corporate attorney, specializing in regulatory compliance for industrial clients. He had married our daughter Nora 5 years ago in a ceremony at the Hermitage Hotel that cost more than my first car. He wore Italian suits that fit like engineering tolerances, tight and precise. His smile had the calibrated warmth of a thermostat set to exactly the right temperature to make you comfortable without ever making you feel truly warm. Dorothy had always been polite to him. Attentive, even. She asked about his cases, remembered his birthday, kept his favorite bourbon in the cabinet. I had taken her courtesy for approval. Now I understood it was surveillance. Have you ever looked at someone you have known for years and suddenly realized you were staring at a stranger wearing a familiar face? I was still holding the deed when the doorbell rang. The sound sent a jolt through my chest that had nothing to do with the December cold. I slid the deed and the letter back into the wooden box, closed the brass clasp, and pushed it into the bottom drawer of my desk. My hands moved with an efficiency that surprised me. The muscle memory of a man who had spent decades handling classified propulsion data at NASA. Some instincts never die. They just wait for a reason to wake up. I opened the front door. Grant Mercer stood on my porch, adjusting the collar of his charcoal overcoat. A few flakes of Nashville snow dusted his shoulders. His smile arrived before his words, perfectly timed. Like a sales presentation he had rehearsed in the car. "Russell," he said, stepping forward without waiting for an invitation. His cologne entered the hallway before he did. Something expensive that smelled like cedar and control. I was passing through the neighborhood and saw a courier van pulling away. Thought I should check in. You know, with the holidays coming up. He glanced past me toward the study, his eyes moving with the quick, acquisitive scan of a man appraising real estate. How are you holding up? The estate paperwork must be a nightmare. Eleanor's accounts, the photography equipment, insurance claims. Let me take some of that off your plate. Eleanor. He always called her Eleanor, never Dorothy, never Dot. It was a small thing I had never noticed before. Now it felt like a fingerprint at a crime scene. Everything is under control, Grant, I said. My voice sounded calm. The engineer in me had taken over, running diagnostics on every word before it left my mouth. The package was just some old correspondence about her equipment insurance. Nothing that concerns you. Grant nodded. But his eyes made one more pass toward the study door. You know, he said, lowering his voice to a register of manufactured intimacy, I have a colleague who specializes in distressed mountain properties. If Dorothy left any dead weight in her portfolio, cabins, land, that sort of thing, I could facilitate a quick, clean sale. No hassle for you. Distressed mountain properties. The phrase landed like a pin dropping in a quiet room. He knew. He did not know the details, but he knew there was property. He had been waiting for the 90-day clock to expire, watching the mailbox the way a predator watches a watering hole. I ushered him toward the door, with the practiced deflection of a man who had survived 40 years of faculty meetings. It took another 8 minutes of his polished small talk before he finally retreated down the porch steps. I closed the door and leaned against it, my pulse hammering in my temples. Through the window beside the door, I watched Grant walk to his black sedan parked across the street. He did not drive away. He sat behind the wheel, pulled out his phone, and made a call. His eyes, illuminated by the glow of the screen, were aimed directly at my study window. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. My mind was already running calculations, the way it always did when a system showed signs of catastrophic failure. Dorothy had spent her last breath warning me about this man. She had built a legal fortress specifically to keep him out. And he had arrived at my door within minutes of the courier's departure, already probing for weaknesses. The iron key sat in the bottom drawer, waiting. And for the first time, In 90 days of grief, I felt something other than loss. I felt the cold, precise ignition of a decision being made. I was going to Tennessee. 48 hours later, Nashville was a fading signal in the rearview mirror, and the Smoky Mountains were swallowing me whole. I had left before dawn, the iron key zipped into the breast pocket of my coat where I could feel its weight against my heart with every breath. The rental SUV was a heavy, unfamiliar machine, and I gripped the steering wheel the way I used to grip the handrails during centrifuge tests at Johnson Space Center, with the quiet understanding that letting go was not an option. Interstate 40 carried me east through a Tennessee that grew wilder with every mile. The flat suburban sprawl of Nashville gave way to rolling farmland, then to the dark, forested ridges that rose like the spine of something ancient and sleeping. By mid-morning, the mountains had closed around me. The Great Smokies earned their name honestly. A thick, rolling fog poured down through the hollows and across the road like a living thing, reducing visibility to the length of 2 car hoods. It was nothing like the clean, hard blizzards I had read about in Wyoming travel guides. This was something older and more patient. The Smoky Mountain fog did not attack. It absorbed. It wrapped itself around your vehicle and your thoughts and your sense of direction until you were no longer driving through a landscape but floating inside a cloud that had settled on the earth and refused to leave. My GPS stuttered, recalculated, and then gave up entirely, its screen displaying a gray void where the road should have been. I was navigating by feel now, following the faded center line as it twisted through switchbacks that seemed designed to test a man's faith in physics. The air outside was heavy with moisture, and even through the closed windows I could smell the forest, a thick perfume of wet pine needles, decaying leaves, and the mineral tang of ancient stone. Have you ever driven into a place that felt like it was deciding whether or not to let you in? I was running low on fuel and patience when a flickering sign appeared through the haze. It was a gas station that looked like it had been old when Eisenhower was president. 2 rusted pumps stood beneath a sagging metal canopy, and the cinder block building behind them was held together more by stubbornness than mortar. A hand-painted sign above the door read Jessup Service in letters that had been repainted so many times. Each one was a slightly different shade of white. I pulled in and cut the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, broken only by the soft ticking of the cooling motor and the distant sound of water moving somewhere in the fog. I stepped out and immediately felt the altitude in my lungs, a thin, damp cold that made each breath feel like it was being rationed. A man emerged from the garage bay, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been waiting. Hank Jessup was 74, with skin the color and texture of a tobacco leaf left too long in the sun. His flannel shirt was faded to the memory of a pattern, and his boots had the kind of deep, permanent mud that suggested they had not been fully cleaned since the previous decade. But his eyes were sharp, pale blue, and utterly awake. They moved from the rental plates to my face and stayed there. "Fill it up?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer to a much larger question. "Please." And I could use directions. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes ago. Hank unscrewed the gas cap with a calloused hand and fitted the nozzle. The metallic click of the pump handle echoed against the fog like a single note played in an empty cathedral. He did not look at me while the tank filled. He looked at the mountains, or rather, at the place where the mountains should have been, hidden behind the white curtain of mist. "Where you headed?" he asked, though again, the question felt ceremonial. I showed him the address on my phone. He glanced at the screen and his hand paused on the pump handle for exactly 1 second. A micro-hesitation that an engineer is trained to notice. "Timber Ridge area," he said quietly. "Up past the creek fork, through the old logging road." He looked at me then, and the casual service station manner dropped away, like a mask being removed. "You are the engineer. She said the mountains would bring you eventually." The fog seemed to thicken around us. I could hear water dripping from the canopy, each drop hitting the concrete, with a clarity that felt amplified. "You knew Dorothy," I said. It was not a question. Hank replaced the nozzle and wiped his hands on a rag that was dirtier than his fingers. She stopped here every time she came up. Winter, summer, did not matter. Always bought a full tank and a bag of those sour candies from the rack inside. He paused. Last time I saw her, she was thin. Too thin. But her eyes were still burning. He leaned against the pump, crossing his arms. The scent of diesel and damp wood smoke clung to him like a second skin. She left something for you. Words, not a package. Made me repeat them back 3 times to make sure I had them right. He cleared his throat. The combination is not in the letter. It is in the sound that saved us both. The sound that saved us both. The words hit me with a disorienting force, like a frequency I had not heard in decades suddenly vibrating through the bones of my skull. I knew immediately that it meant something specific, something only Dorothy and I shared. But standing in the fog beside a gas station that time had forgotten, the memory refused to surface. She also said to tell you this. Hank continued, his voice dropping lower. When the fog rolls in this thick, it is not hiding the mountain from you. It is hiding you from the things that live up there. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone walking into a situation that might not have a return trip. Be careful, Mr. Tate. That lodge has been quiet since she passed. Quiet is not the same as empty. I thanked him and paid for the gas. As I pulled back onto the road, I watched him in the mirror, standing motionless beside the pumps, swallowed by the fog within seconds. The last 3 miles were the longest of my life. The road narrowed to a single lane of crumbling asphalt, hemmed in on both sides by trees so tall and dense they formed a tunnel of dripping green. Then the fog parted, just slightly, and I saw them. 2 massive gateposts made of dark oak and iron, rising out of the mist like the bones of something that had been guarding this silence long before Dorothy arrived, and long before I was brave enough to follow. I put the SUV in park and reached into my breast pocket. The iron key was still warm from my body heat. Dorothy had built something behind those gates that she swore I could never see. And now the fog was lifting, just enough, as if the mountain had finally decided to let me in. The iron key fit the gate lock the way a bone fits its socket, with a deep, mechanical precision that suggested both had been made by the same hand. I turned it and felt the heavy tumbler surrender with a sound like a knuckle cracking. The gate swung inward on oiled hinges, silent despite its weight. And I drove through into a world that Dorothy had kept from me for 6 years. The driveway was a 1/4 mile of packed gravel, winding through old-growth forest. White oaks and tulip poplars stood like columns in a cathedral no one had ever named, their bare winter branches lacing together overhead to form a canopy that filtered the fog into something almost luminous. The ground on either side was carpeted with dead leaves, and the smell that came through my cracked window was ancient. Wet stone, cold earth, and the tannic sweetness of wood slowly returning to the soil. Everything here felt like it had been waiting. The lodge appeared gradually, the way large things do when fog is involved. First, the roofline, a long, low ridge of dark slate. Then the walls, built from native field stone the color of iron and smoke, fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that does not hurry. And finally the full structure, a building that did not sit on the mountainside so much as grow out of it. 2 stories of stone and dark oak timber, with deep covered porches and windows set back into the walls like watchful eyes. It was beautiful and severe. A fortress disguised as a home. I parked and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately, sharper than Nashville, with a dampness that found every gap in my clothing. I stood there, breath blooming in white clouds, staring at a building my wife had somehow built without my knowledge. The scale of it was staggering. This was not a cabin. This was an institution. A lantern appeared around the corner of the building, swinging in a slow, deliberate arc. The man holding it moved the way old timber moves, with a settled weight that suggested he could not be pushed and did not intend to be. Earl Fenton was 70 years old, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same fieldstone as the lodge. He wore a fleece jacket, the color of wet bark, and his boots were laced with the double knot of a man who expected to be on his feet all day. He stopped 10 feet from me and held the lantern higher. Its light caught the iron key, still clutched in my hand, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise. Recognition. "You are late, Mr. Tate," he said. His voice had the low, unhurried cadence of someone who measured time in seasons rather than hours. "She said the fog would not stop an engineer." "You knew I was coming," I said. Earl lowered the lantern and nodded once. "Hired me 6 years ago. One instruction. Wait for the man with the iron key." He paused, looking at the lodge, the way a soldier looks at a post he has defended alone for too long. "She paid my salary 5 years in advance. Said the man with the key would need a guide, and that I should not ask questions until he was ready to hear the answers. 5 years in advance." Dorothy had planned for my arrival with the same precision she planned everything else, accounting for variables I did not even know existed. I felt a strange vertigo, the sensation of standing on solid ground while the earth beneath it rearranges itself. Earl led me up the porch steps and through the front door. The interior of the lodge hit me like a held breath finally released. The great room was enormous, anchored by a stone fireplace large enough for a man to stand inside. The mantel was a single slab of rough-hewn oak, and above it hung a framed photograph of a red-tailed hawk mid-dive, talons extended, eyes fixed on something below the frame. Dorothy's work. I recognized her eye immediately, the way she always captured the moment, just before contact, the instant when intention becomes action. The floors were wide plank heart pine, and the walls were a mix of stone and timber that made the room feel both ancient and engineered. Heavy leather furniture faced the hearth, and the air smelled of cedar, wood smoke, and something faintly chemical that I could not immediately place. Earl moved to the fireplace and added a log to a fire that was already burning. He had prepared for my arrival. "Coffee is on the counter," he said, gesturing toward a kitchen that opened off the great room. "She kept the good beans in the freezer. 3rd shelf." I did not want coffee. I wanted answers. But I took a mug anyway, because an engineer understands that complex problems require sustained attention, and sustained attention requires caffeine. Have you ever walked into a place you have never been and felt the presence of someone who is no longer alive? The lodge was full of Dorothy. Not her things exactly, though there were traces. A pair of binoculars on the windowsill. A bird identification guide dog eared to the warbler section. A ceramic mug with a chipped handle that matched the one she kept at home. But it was more than objects. It was the architecture of her thinking. The way the bookshelves were organized. The angle of the desk lamp. The specific height at which the coat hooks were mounted. Exactly 5 feet 4 inches. Her height. The measurement of a woman who built everything to her own specifications. Earl watched me absorb the space. Then he turned and walked down a hallway that led deeper into the lodge. "There is something else," he said. "The room she told me never to enter." I followed him past a series of closed doors until we reached the end of the corridor. The door here was different from the others. Heavier, reinforced with a steel frame that someone had tried to disguise with a wooden facade. A red light glowed faintly above the handle, the kind of safe light used in photographic darkrooms. Earl stopped. "This was her space, Mr. Tate. I have worked here 6 years and never set foot inside. She said you would know what to do when you found it." I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. The sharp, acrid bite of photographic chemicals mixed with something else. Something clinical. The front section of the room looked like a standard darkroom. Developing trays, and in larger, clotheslines strung with prints of hawks and songbirds. Dorothy's cover story, hanging in the red light, like evidence of a life I thought was real. But the back wall did not match. Behind a row of framed bird photographs, the surface was not drywall. It was brushed steel, painted to blend with the surrounding walls. I reached out and touched it. The metal was cold beneath my fingertips, and when I pressed, I felt a faint vibration. Something behind this wall was running. A machine. A system. A secret that had been humming in the dark for 6 years, waiting for the man with the iron key to finally stop looking at the birds and start looking at what was behind them. I lifted the first photograph off its hook. Behind it, recessed into the steel, was a keypad with a small digital screen. The cursor blinked green, patient and expectant. It was asking for a combination I did not yet have. I stood in front of the keypad, the green cursor blinking with the patience of a machine that had been waiting 6 years. The sound that saved us both. Hank's words circled my mind like a frequency searching for a receiver. Dorothy had encoded the answer in a memory only we shared. I closed my eyes. The red safe light pressed against my eyelids. I let my mind drift backward through decades. Anniversaries, arguments, vacations, gone wrong. But Dorothy had not said the moment that defined us. She said the sound that saved us both. Saved. Not cherished. Saved. Houston. 1989. The propulsion test lab at Johnson Space Center. I was a junior engineer running a combustion sequence when a ruptured gasket turned the test chamber into a fireball. Dorothy was there that day, photographing equipment for a NASA public relations contract. The blast shattered the observation corridor glass. I remember the heat and the chemical stench. But what I remember most is the fire alarm. A sustained tone at exactly 440 hertz. The A above middle C. It cut through the smoke like a blade made of pure frequency. I grabbed Dorothy and dragged her through a service corridor. We burst into the parking lot, gasping, clothes stinking of smoke. She turned to me, face streaked with soot, and said, "That sound saved us both, Russ." I typed it. 4, 4, 0, A, 1, 9, 8, 9. The screen flashed green. A hydraulic hiss broke the silence, and the steel wall swung inward. The room beyond was not a dark room. It was a laboratory. Fluorescent tubes flickered overhead, casting clinical light across a space, roughly 20 feet square. The air carried the sharp scent of ozone and chemical preservatives. Along the left wall, metal shelves held glass jars of water samples, each labeled with a date, location code, and color tag. Most tags were red. The right wall stopped my breathing. A massive corkboard covered it floor to ceiling. Topographical maps of the Smoky Mountains with 3 towns circled in red: Millhaven, Cedar Bluff, Piney Creek. Blue ink lines traced underground water systems flowing from the mountains through each community. At various points, Dorothy had pinned photographs. Not birds. Industrial discharge pipes photographed at night, pouring dark liquid into creek beds. Beside each photo, a chemical analysis printout and Dorothy's handwritten notation. At the center, connected to everything by red string, was an 8x10 photograph of Grant Mercer, circled in red. His corporate headshot surrounded by bank statements, consulting invoices, and covert photographs of him with men in hard hats outside an industrial facility. Have you ever discovered that the person you slept beside for 31 years was fighting a war you did not know existed? My legs found the nearest chair. I was looking at an intelligence operation built by a woman who could not remember to replace the kitchen sponge. Earl stood in the doorway. She said you were not ready. Not while she was alive. A small steel safe sat beneath the desk. The iron key opened it. Inside, a USB drive and an envelope marked, "Begin here." I plugged the drive into the laptop. 12 files appeared, labeled January through December. 1 letter per month for the year following her death. I opened January. Dorothy's scanned handwriting filled the screen, accompanied by an audio recording. I pressed play, and the room filled with a voice I thought I would never hear again. "My dearest Russell, if you are hearing this, you have found the lab, you have seen the wall, and you are probably sitting in that chair wondering how the woman who burned eggs every Sunday managed to build all this without you noticing. The answer is simple. You were not looking. And I needed you not to look. Her voice grew heavier. I have ALS. You know that. But the ALS was not the primary killer. It was the accelerant. For 3 years I have been drinking water contaminated with arsenic at 40 times the federal limit. The contamination comes from Pinnacle Industries, a chemical manufacturer that has been dumping waste into the Eagle Creek watershed for 15 years. The poison traveled through groundwater into the supply of 3 towns: Millhaven, Cedar Bluff, Piney Creek. 12,000 people drinking poison. Russell. And the man responsible for keeping it secret is the man who married our daughter. I gripped the desk edge until my knuckles went white. Grant is not just a corporate attorney. He is the chief legal fixer for Pinnacle. He designed the shell companies hiding the dumping. He bribed the inspectors. When I sent samples to the EPA, he made sure they disappeared before anyone read them. Her voice dropped to a whisper that felt like a blade. I did not die of ALS, Russell. I was poisoned. The same water killing the children of Millhaven killed me. And the man who made sure that poison kept flowing is the man who tucks your grandchildren into bed every night. She revealed one more thing. She had purchased Nora's $400,000 student debt from Grant, transferring the leverage he held over our daughter into her own hands. A chess move made from a hospital bed. The audio ended. I tried to pick up my coffee mug, but my hands were shaking too badly. Earl reached over from the doorway and steadied it for me. The way you steady a glass for a man who has just learned the world is not the shape he thought. Then the security monitor chirped. On the screen, 2 headlights were cutting through the fog on the access road, moving steadily toward the lodge. Someone was coming. And the mountain was no longer hiding me. I closed the lab door and locked it in the same motion. The headlights on the security monitor were growing larger. 2 predatory eyes climbing the mountain road with an urgency that did not belong to a casual visitor. I slid the USB drive into my coat pocket and pulled the bird photographs back over the steel wall. By the time the engine noise reached the lodge, the dark room looked like nothing more than a place where a dead woman once developed pictures of hawks. Earl met me in the great room. He did not ask questions. He simply positioned himself near the kitchen doorway, a silent mass of flannel and fieldstone patience, and waited. The front door opened without a knock. Grant Mercer stepped into the lodge the way a man steps into a property he has already appraised. His charcoal overcoat was dusted with mountain mist, and his shoes, Italian leather entirely wrong for a gravel road, clicked against the heart pine floors with the sound of someone counting money. Behind him, smaller and slower, came Nora. My daughter looked like she had been folded into herself. She clutched a designer handbag against her chest, the way a child clutches a stuffed animal, and her eyes moved to Grant before they moved to me, checking his temperature before she dared to speak. She was 37 years old. But standing in the shadow of her husband, she looked closer to 15. Dad. Her voice was thin and careful, a wire stretched to its limit. You should not be here alone. It is too remote, too dangerous. Mom was not herself when she did all this. She was sick. Grant did not wait for my response. He was already circling the great room, running his fingers along the mantel, glancing up at the ceiling beams, calculating square footage with the professional reflex of a man who sees dollar signs in every structure. The firelight reflected off his glasses, turning his eyes into 2 flat discs of orange. "Impressive bones," he said, his voice dropping into the smooth register he used for boardroom presentations. But a 600-acre conservation property in the Smokies with no revenue stream is a black hole, Russell. Maintenance, property taxes, winter damage. You will bleed money up here. He reached into his coat and produced a leather portfolio, dropping it onto the coffee table with a thud that echoed through the room. The fire popped at the same moment. A sharp crack of pine that sounded like a warning shot. Ridgeline Partners, Grant continued. 18 million. They specialize in conservation buyouts. Environmentally sensitive, legally clean. You sign the intent letter, they handle the transition, and you go back to Nashville with enough money to never think about a leaking roof again. 18 million. I thought of the lab behind the dark room. The maps, the water samples, the photograph of this man's face, circled in red at the center of a web of industrial crime. And I thought of Dorothy's voice saying 12,000 people. "The property is not for sale, Grant," I said. My voice sounded like gravel, and I did not try to soften it. "The trust is irrevocable. Dorothy designed it that way." Grant's smile thinned. He took a step closer, the synthetic warmth of his cologne mixing with the wood smoke. "Trusts can be challenged, Russell, especially when they were drafted by a woman in cognitive decline. I have seen it happen. Courts are sympathetic to families trying to correct the mistakes of a terminally ill loved one." He let the word mistakes hang in the air like smoke. "A retired engineer does not survive a mountain winter alone," he added, his tone shifting from persuasion to something colder. "Accidents happen up here all the time. Pipes freeze. Power goes out. A man your age falls on ice and nobody finds him for days. Have you ever listened to a man threaten your life while smiling at you with the face your grandchildren call Papa Grant?" I held his gaze and said nothing. Silence is a tool engineers understand. When a system is under stress, you do not add input. You observe. Grant held the silence for 10 seconds before breaking it with a manufactured sigh. He picked up the portfolio and tucked it back into his coat. "Think about it," he said. "The offer has a 30-day window. After that, things get complicated." He turned toward the door, pausing to place a hand on Nora's shoulder. The gesture looked protective. It was a leash. I watched them leave from the porch. Grant's rental sedan disappeared into the fog, its taillights bleeding red into the white. Nora had not looked back. She had not said goodbye. She had spoken exactly 7 words the entire visit, and every one of them had been scripted by the man sitting beside her. I went inside and locked the door. The fire was dying, and the lodge felt larger than it had an hour ago. Larger and more exposed. Earl found me in the kitchen at 11 that night. I was making tea, the simple act of boiling water feeling like a small rebellion against everything Grant represented. Earl did not knock. He simply appeared in the doorway, his face harder than I had ever seen it. "Mr. Tate, you need to come outside." He led me through the mudroom to the utility area behind the lodge, where the water filtration system was housed. A panel had been removed from the main holding tank, the screws placed neatly on the ground beside it. Earl handed me one of the test strips Dorothy had stored in the lab, color-coded and calibrated for arsenic detection. I dipped it into the tank water and watched the indicator climb past every safe threshold on the chart, turning a deep, angry red. Arsenic. 50 times the permissible limit. Someone had introduced a concentrated solution directly into our water supply while Grant was keeping me busy in the great room. I stared at the test strip. The red felt personal. Grant had used the same poison that killed Dorothy, the same weapon Pinnacle had been pumping into the ground for 15 years to try to kill me. "He is not just trying to take the land, Earl," I whispered. "He is trying to kill me, the same way he killed her." Earl nodded slowly. Then he pointed toward the security monitor mounted on the utility wall. The East Ridge camera showed a single heat signature standing motionless among the trees, watching, not moving, just standing in the fog like a sentry, posted at the edge of a war that had been declared long before I arrived. Sheriff Ray Dawkins arrived at the lodge the next morning in a mud-splattered cruiser that looked as tired as the man driving it. He was 55, with a face that carried the deep, weathered lines of someone who had spent decades mediating between the law and the mountains. And the mountains usually won. His boots left wet prints on the porch as he followed me to the utility area, his eyes scanning the property with the professional wariness of a man who had seen too many accidents that were not accidents. I showed him the water tank. I showed him the removed panel, the screws placed neatly on the ground, the test strip still glowing an accusatory red. I showed him the security camera footage of the heat signature on the East Ridge. I laid it out the way. I would lay out an engineering report, with data points and evidence, and a clear chain of causation. Dawkins studied everything. He crouched beside the tank, ran his finger along the threads of the access panel, and nodded slowly. "Someone opened this with the right tools," he said. "This was not weather damage." "Then arrest him," I said. Dawkins stood up, brushed his knees, and looked at me with an expression I recognized. It was the look engineers give each other when a design fails and there is no budget for a redesign. "I cannot arrest arsenic levels, Mr. Tate. The fog erased every boot print between here and the tree line. That heat signature on your camera is a blur on public land. And the water contamination, while clearly deliberate, has no fingerprints on it." He paused. "A good defense attorney would call it groundwater seepage from a natural mineral deposit. This is the Smokies. Arsenic occurs naturally in the bedrock, naturally at 50 times the federal limit. I am telling you what a courtroom would hear, not what I believe." He met my eyes, and for a moment, the professional mask slipped. "I believe you, Mr. Tate. But belief does not issue warrants." He left me standing beside a poisoned water tank with nothing but a red test strip and the growing certainty that the law was a wall built to protect the wrong people. I watched his cruiser disappear down the gravel road and felt something crack inside the careful, analytical framework that had governed my entire life. For the first time, in 66 years, I was angry. Not frustrated, not disappointed. Angry. The kind of anger that does not shout. It calculates. I went inside and called my son. Wade Tate answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the rapid intensity of a man who spent more time with river samples than people. He was 39, a hydrologist at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and he had inherited Dorothy's stubbornness along with my analytical mind. He did not ask how I was doing. He had heard through the university network about Dorothy's property, and his brain was already 3 steps ahead of pleasantries. "Dad, you have no idea what you are sitting on," he said, his words colliding with each other. "I have been studying the hydrogeological surveys of that region for years. That 620 acres is not just scenic forest. It is a headwater system. The creeks originating on that property feed the primary aquifer for 3 downstream communities." "Which communities?" I asked, though I already knew. "Millhaven, Cedar Bluff, Piney Creek. Combined population around 12,000. Every drop of water those people drink, cook with, and bathe in originates somewhere on the land you are standing on. Is it possible to fall in love with your wife all over again while discovering she was a stranger for half your marriage?" Wade continued. And the revelation that followed rewired my understanding of the previous 5 years. Dorothy had been secretly funneling research grants to his department through an anonymous donor account. He had never known the source. She had funded the very hydrological mapping that could now prove the contamination pathway from Pinnacle's dump site to the 3 towns. "Mom was not photographing birds, Dad," Wade said, his voice dropping. "She was mapping poison. She was collecting the baseline data my department needed to prove that property is the source point for the entire contamination plume. She was building the scientific case from the inside." I sat at the kitchen table, the cold morning air still carrying a faint chemical trace from the sabotaged water tank. My wife had not just been a photographer or a secret investigator. She had been funding the army that would eventually fight her war. I opened the second letter that evening. Dorothy's handwriting filled the screen, steadier than the first letter, as though she had found a rhythm in the act of confessing. "Russell, by now you have spoken to Wade. He will tell you about the water. Let me tell you where to find the proof." She described 2 monitoring wells she had drilled in secret on the western slope, disguised as fence post holes. She gave me GPS coordinates and instructions for sample collection. Then her tone shifted. "I sent water samples to the EPA 3 times over 2 years. Each time, the case files were opened, logged into the system, and then vanished before any analyst could review them. Someone inside the agency is protecting Pinnacle. The files did not lose themselves, Russell. They were erased by a hand that knew exactly which drawer to reach into." Her final line in the second letter carried the weight of everything she had built. "The water rights on this property are worth more than the timber, More than the views, more than the lodge itself. They are worth more than your life, Russell. And Grant knows it. The next morning, Earl and I hiked to the western slope. We found the monitoring wells exactly where Dorothy described, two steel pipes capped with weatherproof seals, sunk into the earth beside old fence posts. I uncapped the first well and lowered a sample vial on a cord. When I pulled it up and dipped a test strip, the indicator turned the same deep, furious red I had seen in the lodge water tank. I stood there, holding the strip up to the gray mountain light. This was not a localized leak. This was a river of poison running beneath the surface of the mountain, feeding into the water table of 12,000 people. Dorothy, I whispered, you were not just taking pictures. You were building an army. Earl stood beside me, looking at the strip. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. That the color red had not already screamed. That evening Wade called back. His voice was different this time. Quieter. Controlled. Dad, one of my graduate students found something in Mom's old correspondence files. She was in contact with someone at the federal level, not the regular EPA intake office. Someone in the Criminal Investigation Division. Someone who has been waiting for us to show up with exactly the kind of evidence you are now holding. I looked out the window at the Smoky Mountains, their ridges hidden behind the eternal fog. Dorothy had not just mapped the poison. She had mapped the path to justice, and she had made sure that when I finally walked it, I would not be walking alone. Grant returned 4 days later, and desperation had finally eaten through his polish. I was on the porch checking the repaired water filtration system when his rental sedan crawled up the drive. He stepped out, and I barely recognized the man who had dropped an $18 million portfolio on my coffee table with the confidence of a closer. His suit was wrinkled. His tie hung loose. The skin beneath his eyes carried the bruised, sleepless look of a man whose creditors do not observe business hours. He did not bother with pleasantries. He walked up the steps, planted himself 3 feet from me, and said, 32 million. The number hung in the mountain air like a distress signal. Forget the 18. My partners can go significantly higher. 32 million, Russell. You sign today. The money wires tomorrow. You take the grandchildren to Europe. You never think about water samples or test strips again. I watched his hands. They were trembling. A fine, persistent vibration that he tried to hide by shoving them into his coat pockets. An engineer reads tremors the way a doctor reads pulse. Grant's hands were telling me that the pressure on him had escalated beyond anything a real estate deal could explain. Someone was squeezing him, and he was running out of room. You do not understand what is at stake here, he said. And for a half-second the corporate mask slipped entirely. His voice cracked on the word stake, and I saw something in his eyes that was not greed. It was fear. Pure, cornered animal fear. This is not just about money anymore, Russell. It never was, I said quietly. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to his car without another word. No threats this time. No mentions of mountain accidents or frozen pipes. Just the heavy silence of a man who had played his last persuasive card and watched it land face down. I watched him drive away. The fog swallowed his taillights within seconds. Have you ever poured yourself a cup of coffee and wondered if it would be your last? The next morning began the way mornings should. Quiet. Unremarkable. I woke at 6, pulled on a flannel shirt, and walked to the kitchen where Earl had already started a fire in the great room. The lodge smelled of cedar and wood smoke. Through the window, the Smoky Mountains were doing what they always did. Hiding behind a curtain of white mist, keeping their secrets the way my wife had kept hers. I reached for the steel thermos on the kitchen counter. It was the one I used every morning, a heavy insulated cylinder that kept coffee hot for hours. I poured a full mug, added a spoonful of sugar, and drank it standing at the window. The coffee tasted slightly bitter, but mountain water always gave coffee a mineral edge. I did not think twice about it. I should have. 30 minutes later, the world shifted beneath my feet. It started in my hands, a tingling numbness that spread from my fingertips up through my wrists. as if the blood in my veins had been replaced with something heavier. I set the mug down and flexed my fingers. They responded slowly, like signals traveling through damaged wire. Then my vision blurred. Not gradually. A sudden lateral smear, as if someone had dragged a wet thumb across the lens of my eyes. I blinked hard, gripped the counter edge, and felt my heart stutter. Not skip. Stutter. A chaotic, a rhythmic hammering that felt like an engine misfiring on 3 of 4 cylinders. I knew what was happening. The engineer in me diagnosed it before the patient in me could panic. Acute arsenic poisoning. Cardiac arrhythmia. The poison was forcing my heart into a rhythm it could not sustain. The floor came up fast. My knees buckled, and I hit the slate tiles with a force that rattled my teeth and sent a white flash across my darkening vision. The cold. The slate was cold against my cheek, the same cold from the flash forward that opened this story. The copper taste flooding my mouth. The yellow halos pulsing at the edges of sight. The kitchen ceiling spinning above me like a system losing its axis. I tried to call for Earl. My throat locked. The muscles in my neck constricted as if someone had wrapped a hand around my windpipe. I could hear the fire crackling in the great room, the ticking of the mantel clock. The wind outside. Sounds that should have been comforting now, forming the soundtrack to what felt unmistakably like the final minutes of my life. Earl. The word came out as a whisper that died before it reached the doorway. My heart was no longer beating. It was convulsing. A frantic, purposeless seizure behind my ribs that produced no rhythm, only chaos. I thought of Dorothy. I thought of her voice on the recording. Steady and controlled, even as she described her own poisoning. She had endured this. For years, molecule by molecule. She had felt this same metallic invasion and kept working, kept building, kept writing letters to a husband she knew she would never see again. The edges of my vision began to collapse inward. A dark tunnel narrowing toward a single point of yellow light. I could feel my consciousness thinning, spreading out like water on a flat surface, seeking the lowest point. Then a shadow appeared in the kitchen doorway. I fought to focus. The shape was familiar. Smaller than Earl. Standing perfectly still. My vision cleared just enough to see her face. Nora. My daughter stood in the doorway, her coat wet from the morning fog. In her right hand she held a small plastic case. I recognized it through the haze. It was one of Dorothy's water testing kits from the lab. Nora had found it. Or she had known where to look. Either way, she was holding the instrument that could confirm what was killing me. She did not move. Her eyes were wide and wet. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts that fogged in the cold kitchen air. Her left hand gripped the door frame so hard her knuckles had gone white. She looked at me on the floor, looked at the thermos on the counter, and looked at the test kit in her hand. And she stayed exactly where she was. She was holding the test that could confirm someone had tried to murder me. But Grant had already broken something inside her that no test kit could measure. She was caught between the father bleeding on the floor and the husband who had promised to take her children if she ever stopped obeying. The darkness was closing in. The last thing I saw before it took me was my daughter's face, frozen in the doorway, torn between two kinds of death. The sound that brought me back was not a voice. It was wood splintering. The mudroom door exploded inward, and Earl Fenton's boots hit the kitchen floor with the urgency of a man who had heard silence where there should have been noise. I felt hands grip my shoulders, felt the cold rush of outside air as he dragged me away from the counter, away from the thermos, away from the slow poison still working through my bloodstream. My head rolled against the slate. And through the narrowing tunnel of my vision, I saw the security monitor mounted on the kitchen wall. The screen was split into quadrants. In the upper left, a timestamp read 2 hours earlier. The image showed the lodge kitchen, empty and dark. Then a figure entered the frame. Grant, moving with the careful precision of a man who had done this before. He opened the thermos, produced a small glass vial from his coat pocket, and tapped a white powder into the steel cylinder. He recapped it. wiped the surface with his sleeve, and placed it back on the counter in exactly the same position. Then he turned toward the camera. He did not know it was there, but the angle caught his face perfectly, and he was smiling. The footage was the last thing I saw before the darkness took me completely. I woke to the sound of machines, the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor, steady and artificial, telling me I was alive in a tone that sounded more like an accusation than a comfort. The fluorescent lights of Park Ridge Medical Center in Knoxville pressed against my eyelids like hot metal. The air was antiseptic and recycled, a sterile contrast to the cedar and wood smoke I had grown accustomed to at the lodge. My chest felt like it had been dismantled and reassembled by someone working from an incomplete blueprint. A dull, persistent ache radiated from behind my sternum, the residual damage of a heart that had spent hours fighting a chemical it was never designed to encounter. Earl was standing by the door, arms crossed, his expression carved from the same granite as the Smoky Mountain ridges. When he saw my eyes open, he nodded once, a sentinel acknowledging that the perimeter was still holding. The attending physician, a young woman with wire-framed glasses and the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to delivering catastrophic news, checked my chart and explained the situation with surgical precision. Acute arsenic poisoning, blood levels consistent with a single large dose ingested orally. Cardiac arrhythmia, requiring chemical cardioversion. Liver stress markers elevated. Kidney function compromised, but recovering. Whoever did this was not experimenting, Mr. Tate, she said, adjusting her stethoscope. The dosage was calculated. Another 30 minutes without intervention, and we would be having a very different conversation. It was not an accident, doctor, I said. My voice was a rasp, my throat still raw. I know exactly who poured it. She held my gaze for a moment, then made a note on the chart and left the room. The silence that followed was filled only by the cardiac monitor and the distant hum of hospital machinery. Earl moved closer. The camera footage is saved to the secure server, he said, his voice low. Timestamp, face, the vial, all of it. She built that system for exactly this moment. Dorothy. Even from the grave, she had provided the evidence. I felt a complicated wave of gratitude and grief crash through me. The two emotions tangled together like roots from the same tree. Then Dawkins arrived. He did not come to collect evidence. He came to deliver a different kind of weapon. Sheriff Ray Dawkins walked into my hospital room with a manila folder in his hand and an expression that told me the blow was coming before he even opened his mouth. Russell, I am not here about the poisoning, he said. He set the folder on the bedside table. Grant's attorneys filed this 2 hours ago. I opened the folder. The header read, Petition for Emergency Conservatorship. The legal language blurred together, but certain phrases surfaced like shrapnel. Grief, induced cognitive decline, paranoid delusions regarding poisoning, inability to manage complex financial assets, danger to self in isolated mountain environment. It was a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, to strip my authority as trustee, to freeze every asset Dorothy had left me and place control of the lodge in the hands of a court-appointed guardian. And at the bottom of the signature page, beneath Grant's name, was the signature of my daughter, Nora Tate Mercer. She had co-signed the document, alleging that her father was losing his mind. How do you prove you are sane to a system that profits from declaring you broken? I stared at Nora's signature. The handwriting was tight and uneven, pressed too hard into the paper, the script of someone whose hand was being guided by a fist they could not see. She had signed it under duress. I was certain of that. Grant had used the custody of Lily and Sam as the lever, the same way he used everything, with precision and without mercy. But the signature was real. And in the eyes of the law, real was all that mattered. There is more, Dawkins said. He pointed to the second page. The court had appointed a psychiatric evaluator to assess my competency, Dr. Elaine Pryor. The name meant nothing to me until Dawkins added quietly, She is listed as a medical consultant for a company called Pinnacle Industries. has been for the last 4 years. The room seemed to contract around me. The beeping of the monitor accelerated slightly, tracking the spike in my pulse. Grant had not just filed a legal attack, he had stacked the deck. The doctor who would evaluate my sanity was employed by the same corporation whose crimes I was trying to expose. I looked at the cardiac monitor. The green line traced a pattern that was steady but fragile. The rhythm of a heart that had survived poison, but was now being asked to survive something worse. They were not just trying to kill my body, they were trying to kill my mind, and they were using my own daughter's name as the blade. Earl stood motionless by the door. "What do you want to do?" he asked. I looked at the petition, then at the window where the Knoxville skyline was sharp against a winter sky. Somewhere beyond those buildings, the Smoky Mountains were waiting. The lodge was waiting. Dorothy's evidence was waiting. And 12,000 people were still drinking water that was slowly killing them. "Sign me out," I said. The discharge papers shook in my hand as I signed them. The attending physician protested. Earl protested. My kidneys, still filtering arsenic residue, protested loudest of all. But I had spent my career making decisions under pressure, and the pressure behind me was heavier than the pressure ahead. Grant was not going to wait for me to recover. Every hour I lay in that hospital bed was an hour he used to tighten the legal noose. Earl drove me to a used truck lot outside Knoxville, where I paid cash for a heavy-duty pickup, the kind of vehicle that could handle mountain roads and did not require a rental agreement traceable to my name. He followed me in his own truck as far as the Gatlinburg Junction, then split off to check the lodge perimeter. I continued alone toward Newfound Gap Road, the most direct route back to the property. The road climbed into the Smokies like a scar cut into the mountainside. Switchbacks stacked on top of switchbacks, each curve tighter than the last, with a sheer drop on the eastern side that disappeared into fog so thick it looked solid. I gripped the wheel and focused on the center line, a faded yellow thread that was the only thing separating forward motion from freefall. I was halfway up the pass, altitude climbing past 4,000 feet, when the brake pedal went soft. Not spongy, not gradual. The pedal simply dropped to the floorboard with the passive compliance of something that had already been decided. I pumped it twice. Nothing. No resistance. No friction. Just my boot meeting metal and the speedometer beginning its patient climb towards 60. My heart, still bruised from the arsenic, hammered against my ribs. But the engineer took over before the panic could settle. I had spent 30 years calculating escape velocities for objects traveling at 17,000 miles per hour. The math for a 2-ton truck on a 10% grade was simpler. Terrifying, but simpler. I downshifted. The transmission screamed as I dropped from 4th to 2nd, the engine braking dragging my speed down from 60 to 45. The truck shuddered, like an animal fighting a leash. I reached for the emergency brake and pulled. The handle came up with no resistance. The cable was slack. Dead. Cut. Just like the hydraulic lines. The next switchback was 200 yards ahead. A sharp left turn with nothing beyond the guardrail but 1,000 feet of mountain air and a valley floor. I would never reach alive. I had 4 seconds to make a decision. On my right, a maintenance pull-off was cut into the hillside. Beyond it, a snowbank had accumulated against the rock face, packed hard by weeks of mountain winter. It was not soft. It was not safe, but it was solid matter. And solid matter was preferable to the alternative. I wrenched the wheel right. The truck left the asphalt with a sound like tearing fabric. I hit the snowbank at 45 miles per hour. The world exploded. The airbag detonated with a chemical crack, filling the cab with white dust and the acrid smell of burnt propellant. My body slammed against the seatbelt. My ribs, already weakened, howled in protest. The windshield fractured into a web of frosted glass. Then silence. Absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine and the distant sound of water moving somewhere beneath the snow. Have you ever survived something and immediately understood that surviving was not the point? The point was that someone wanted you not to. I do not know how long I sat there, before a passing motorist found me. By afternoon, I was standing in a repair garage on the outskirts of Gatlinburg. The mechanic was a broad-shouldered man with permanently grease-stained hands and the blunt, unimpressed demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of mechanical failure the mountains could produce. He slid out from beneath the wrecked truck, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me the way a coroner looks at someone who should be on his table. "This was not a road accident, mister," he said. His voice was flat, factual. "Someone gave you a one-way ticket off this mountain." He gestured for me to look. The brake lines had not corroded. They had not been nicked by road debris. They had been severed with a precision cutting tool, the kind of instrument used in industrial maintenance. The cut was clean, surgical, a professional job, and your emergency cable, he added, pointing to a second severed line. Same tool, same hand. Whoever did this wanted to make sure you had no backup plan. He reached into the undercarriage and pulled out a small slip of plastic that had been caught in the crossmember. A hotel valet parking tag, dated 3 days ago, from a hotel in Knoxville. The saboteur had not just appeared at the lodge. They had been following me, staying in the same city where I was hospitalized. Waiting for the moment, I was alone on the most dangerous road in the Smokies. I pocketed the valet tag and called Dawkins. He answered on the first ring, but his voice carried a weight I had not heard before. "Russell, I know about the brake lines. I will send a deputy for the evidence." He paused. The silence on the line felt like a held breath. "But there is something else. Grant's attorneys filed an emergency motion this morning. They are requesting a full asset freeze and a court order barring you from the property. As of tomorrow morning, you may not legally be allowed to set foot in your own lodge." I stood in the garage, grease on my hands, a valet tag in my pocket, and the Smoky Mountains visible through the open bay door. They were burying me, not in the ground, in paper. Layer after "They are burying me in paper, Ray," I said. While they buried her in poison, the line was quiet for a long time. Then Dawkins said, "I know. And I am sorry I cannot dig faster." She came alone. No charcoal coat beside her. No leather portfolio. No rehearsed legal language designed to make theft sound like mercy. Just Nora, standing at the lodge gate in a rain-streaked wool jacket with her mother's cheekbones and her father's stubborn jaw, holding a grocery bag in one hand and a digital voice recorder in the other. Earl saw her first on the East Ridge camera. He picked up the shotgun. "Put it down," I said. She signed the petition, "Russell. She's my daughter." Earl set the gun against the wall but kept his hand within reach. I walked to the front door and opened it before she could knock. Nora's eyes were swollen. Not the theatrical redness of a woman performing grief. The raw, cracked skin of someone who had not slept in days. She smelled like gas station coffee and the lavender detergent Dorothy used to buy in bulk from a pharmacy in Cedar Bluff. "Dad." I hadn't heard that word from her in 11 months. The last time was a voicemail I'd replayed so many times the audio had started to distort. "Dad, Grant says it's better if we don't talk for a while. Come inside." She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had collapsed 31 hours earlier, with arsenic burning through my blood. I poured water from a sealed jug Earl had driven to Gatlinburg to buy. Nora wrapped both hands around the glass but didn't drink. "I know what you think of me," she said. "I don't think anything of you, Nora. I'm waiting." She set the recorder on the table between us. A small black rectangle, the kind journalists use for interviews. A single red indicator light glowed on its side. "Before I say anything, I need you to understand 3 things. She held up fingers, ticking them off. 1. I signed the petition because Grant told me you had early-stage dementia and were going to sell the property to a logging company. 2. I didn't know about the thermos until I walked into this kitchen and saw you on the floor. 3. This recorder contains a conversation between Grant and a man named Victor Kane, recorded 14 months ago in our dining room in Nashville. My hands went still. Who is Victor Kane, Pinnacle Industries' chief waste disposal contractor? The man Grant hired to manage the Eagle Creek discharge pipeline. She pushed the recorder 2 inches closer to me. The man Grant ordered to increase arsenic concentration in the discharge water the same month, Mom's neurologist confirmed her ALS diagnosis. The kitchen was silent except for the hum of the filtration unit Earl had installed that morning. Say that again, I said. Nora's voice did not waver. Grant knew Mom was investigating the water contamination. He knew she had samples, photographs, and correspondence with the EPA Criminal Investigation Division. Victor Kane told him the only way to bury the evidence was to bury the investigator. Grant authorized a 60% increase in discharge volume through the Eagle Creek pipeline, knowing the arsenic concentration in the downstream aquifer would spike. Knowing Mom drank that water every single morning from the well behind this lodge, I pressed my palms flat against the table to keep them from shaking. The wood grain blurred. He killed her, I said. Not a question. He accelerated her death by at least 3 years. The neurologist estimated her natural ALS progression would have given her until 70. She was 63. 7 years. Grant Mercer had stolen 7 years of Dorothy's life to protect a waste disposal contract worth less than 2 fiscal quarters of Pinnacle's annual revenue. Why do you have this recording? Nora closed her eyes. Because Grant doesn't know I was home. He thought I was at a conference in Atlanta. My flight was canceled. I came back early and heard them talking in the dining room. I recorded it on my phone, transferred it to this device, and hid it in a safety deposit box in Chattanooga. 14 months, I said. You've had this for 14 months. And said nothing. He has custody leverage over me, Dad. Her voice cracked for the first time. When Mom bought my student debt from him, the $400,000, she transferred the promissory note into the trust. Grant's attorneys found out. They told me that if I spoke to law enforcement, they would file for sole custody of any future children and declare me financially unstable based on the original debt. You don't have children, Nora. I'm 11 weeks pregnant. The room shifted. Not physically, the walls stayed where they were. The ceiling held, but something inside the architecture of my understanding collapsed and rebuilt itself in a shape I had not anticipated. Grant doesn't know, she continued. And he cannot know. Because the moment he finds out, that child becomes another piece of leverage. She looked at me with Dorothy's eyes. Mom knew. That's why she built this place. Not just to protect the water. To protect me. To give me somewhere to go. When I was finally ready to leave, I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. The recording, I said. What exactly does it contain? Grant's voice clearly identified, instructing Victor Kane to triple the discharge volume through the Eagle Creek pipeline for a minimum of 90 days. Kane confirming the arsenic levels would exceed federal limits by a factor of 40. Grant acknowledging the downstream residential exposure and saying his exact words, "That's not our problem. That's geography. That's not our problem. That's geography." 12,000 people drinking poison. And the man who ordered it called it geography. I picked up the recorder. It weighed almost nothing lighter than the iron key. Lighter than Dorothy's letter. Lighter than every lie I had believed for the past 6 years. But the confession inside it was heavier than all of them combined. Earl, I called. He appeared in the doorway instantly, which meant he had been listening from the hall. Call Wade. Tell him to bring his sampling equipment and a federal chain of custody kit. Then call Sheriff Dawkins. I looked at my daughter. You're staying here tonight. Tomorrow we go to Chattanooga together and retrieve the original recording from the safety deposit box. And Nora, I squeezed her hand. No one is taking anything from you ever again. She broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She folded forward onto the kitchen table and wept the way Dorothy used to weep when she thought no one could hear, silent, shaking, and precise, as if even her grief had been rehearsed to take up as little space as possible. Outside, the East Ridge camera recorded a single pair of headlights turning onto the mountain road, climbing toward us through the rain. Someone was coming. The headlights belonged to Wade. He arrived at 11:14 p.m., carrying 2 aluminum cases of sampling equipment, a federal chain of custody kit, and the expression of a man who had driven 4 hours without stopping, because his father's voice on the phone sounded like something that could not wait until morning. He saw Nora at the kitchen table, stopped in the doorway, and said nothing for a long time. They had not spoken in 9 months. The last conversation had ended with Nora hanging up after Grant took the phone and told Wade that his interference in their marriage was no longer welcome. Wade set the cases on the floor and sat across from his sister. "You look terrible," he said. "You look like Dad," she said. That was enough. In this family, reconciliation did not require ceremony. It required presence. Sheriff Dawkins arrived at 6 the next morning with a forensic technician who cataloged the voice recorder under evidence protocol, duplicated the audio file onto a departmental server, and sealed the original in a tamper-proof bag. Dawkins listened to the recording once in the kitchen, his face still as granite, then walked outside and stood on the porch for 4 minutes without speaking. When he came back inside, he made a single phone call. "I need you to come to Blount County," he said into the receiver. "Bring federal jurisdiction." Over the next 7 days, Dorothy's letters opened like rooms in a house I had never known existed. Letter 3 was dated March, and addressed to no one, just a sheet of paper folded into an envelope marked with a hand-drawn bird. She described the first time she tested the well water and watched the arsenic strip turn a color she had never seen in any field guide. She drove to Millhaven that afternoon and tested the public drinking fountain outside the elementary school. Same color. She sat in her truck for an hour and cried. Letter 4, April, documented her first contact with the EPA Criminal Investigation Division. She had mailed water samples to 3 independent laboratories under a false name. All 3 confirmed arsenic concentrations between 35 and 42 times the federal maximum contaminant level. She included photocopies of the lab reports in the envelope, each one annotated in her careful handwriting with dates, GPS coordinates, and weather conditions on the day of collection. Letter 5. May was the shortest. 4 sentences. They rejected my filing. The regional office said the samples were improperly collected. I know they were not. Someone inside the agency is protecting Pinnacle. Letter 6, June. Contained a name. Tommy Carrillo, a senior special agent within the EPA's Criminal Enforcement Division based in Atlanta, who had contacted Dorothy through a back channel after her rejected filing triggered an internal flag. Carrillo told her that 3 previous complaints about Pinnacle's Smoky Mountain operations had been suppressed at the regional level. He was building a parallel investigation but needed physical evidence collected under proper chain of custody protocols. Evidence that could not be dismissed as contaminated or improperly handled. Dorothy spent the rest of June learning federal evidence collection procedures from a textbook. Carrillo, Letter 7, July, described the construction of the hidden laboratory behind the darkroom. She hired Earl Fenton to manage the physical work because he was the only person in the county who owed nothing to Pinnacle Industries. Earl never asked what the room was for. He built it in 9 days and never mentioned it to anyone. Letter 8, August, was the longest. Dorothy had collected 47 water samples from 19 locations across 3 watersheds over the course of the summer. Every sample exceeded federal arsenic limits. 14 exceeded them by a factor of 30 or more. She mapped the contamination plume and traced it upstream to a single discharge point. The Eagle Creek Pipeline, operated by Victor Kane, under a contract, authorized and supervised by Grant Mercer as Pinnacle's chief regional counsel. She attached a hand-drawn map showing the pipeline route, the discharge coordinates, and the prevailing groundwater flow patterns that carried the arsenic into the aquifer feeding Millhaven, Cedar Bluff, and Piney Creek. I read each letter at the kitchen table with Wade and Nora beside me. Earl stood by the window with his arms crossed. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. On the 5th day, Wade drove to Millhaven and spoke at a town hall meeting organized by Martha Calloway, a 71-year-old retired schoolteacher whose grandson had been diagnosed with peripheral neuropathy at age 14. Wade showed the contamination map on a projector screen. He explained the science in language that did not require a degree to understand. He told them what arsenic does to a human body over 10 years of daily exposure. And he told them the truth, that someone had known, and that someone had chosen profit over their lives. The room held 212 people. When Wade finished, nobody applauded. Martha Calloway stood up in the third row, adjusted her glasses, and said, "What do you need from us?" "Samples," Wade said. "Hair, nails, medical records. The more we have, the harder it is for them to call it coincidence." By the end of the week, 431 residents across 3 towns had submitted biological samples to Wade's mobile testing station. 68% showed arsenic levels consistent with chronic low-dose exposure. The data was devastating and undeniable. On the 7th day, a man in a Navy suit and no tie walked into the lodge without knocking. Earl reached for the shotgun. The man held up a federal badge. "My name is Tommy Carrillo," he said. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to finish what Dorothy started." He looked at the lab, the maps, the letters spread across the kitchen table, and the evidence bags lined up on the counter like soldiers awaiting orders. "She did finish it," I said. Carrillo picked up letter 8 and read the final line, aloud. "If you are reading this, Russell, then I am gone, and the water is still poisoned. Do not let them bury this the way they buried me." He set the letter down. "They won't," he said. "Not this time." Carrillo worked the way Dorothy had worked, quietly, methodically, and with a patience that suggested he had learned long ago that urgency without precision was just noise. He spent 2 days in the hidden laboratory cataloging every sample jar, every photograph, every chemical analysis sheet, and cross-referencing them against the EPA's own suppressed case files, which he carried in a locked aluminum briefcase chained to his wrist during travel. On the 3rd day, he asked me a question I did not expect. "Did Dorothy ever mention a second room?" I looked at Earl. Earl looked at the floor. "She told me there was a place beneath the foundation I was never to open unless the man with the iron key asked," Earl said. "I assumed she meant the lab." "She didn't," Carrillo said. He pulled a folded architectural drawing from his briefcase, a blueprint of the lodge's foundation dated 4 years earlier. Signed by a structural engineer in Knoxville. Beneath the main floor, offset 12 feet to the east and accessible through a hatch concealed under the stone hearth of the great room fireplace, was a reinforced concrete chamber marked in Dorothy's handwriting, "The Record." It took Earl and Wade 40 minutes to move the hearthstones. Beneath them, a steel hatch with a single keyhole sat flush with the subfloor. The iron key fit. I turned it, and the lock released, with a sound like a held breath finally exhaled. The chamber was 8 feet by 12. Climate-controlled and humming with the low vibration of a dehumidification system powered by a dedicated solar panel on the north slope that I had mistaken for part of the lodge's electrical grid. Steel shelving lined 3 walls. The 4th wall held a mounted screen connected to a hard drive, the size of a small suitcase. The shelves contained 15 years of documentation, not Dorothy's 6 years 15. She had somehow obtained Pinnacle Industries' own internal water quality reports dating back to the year the Eagle Creek pipeline began operating. Each annual report was bound in a black folder stamped with Pinnacle's corporate logo. Each one contained arsenic readings that exceeded federal limits. Each one had been signed by Victor Kane as site manager and countersigned by Grant Mercer as supervising legal counsel. And each one had a cover memo recommending that the reports be classified as attorney-client privileged material and excluded from regulatory disclosure. 15 years. Grant had known for 15 years. Carrillo put on latex gloves and opened the earliest folder. The first page showed an arsenic reading of 12 times the federal maximum. The most recent folder, dated the year Dorothy died, showed 41 times. The contamination had not been stable. It had been escalating, year after year, because Pinnacle had increased production capacity without upgrading the discharge treatment system. The cost of proper treatment was estimated in an internal memo at $6.2 million. Grant had written in the margin, in handwriting I recognized from birthday cards he had signed for the past 12 years. Not justified. Maintain current protocol. $6.2 million. That was the price Grant Mercer had placed on 12,000 lives. Wade sat on the bunker floor with his back against the steel shelving and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Nora stood in the hatch opening, one hand on the ladder, unable to come down and unable to walk away. "The land," Carrillo said, breaking the silence. He pointed to a separate shelf containing hydrogeological surveys commissioned by Dorothy from 3 independent firms. "Did she ever tell you what this property is actually worth?" I shook my head. Carrillo spread the surveys across the bunker floor. The 620-acre parcel sat at the headwater of the primary aquifer, feeding all 3 towns. Under Tennessee water law, the property held senior water rights, the oldest and most legally protected allocation in the watershed. Any downstream user, including municipal water systems, was subordinate to the rights attached to this land. "These rights alone," Carrillo said, tapping the survey, "are valued at approximately $30 million based on comparable transactions in the Southeast. Combined with the conservation easement, the timber value, the endangered species habitat corridor, and the mineral rights Dorothy retained, the total appraised value of this property is $45 million. $45 million. Grant's last offer had been 32. "He wasn't being generous," I said. "He was trying to steal it at a discount." Carrillo confirmed. "And if the conservatorship petition succeeds, a court-appointed guardian could potentially negotiate a sale of the trust's assets under a hardship exemption." That was always the endgame. Not the buyout offers, the petition. The legal architecture of Grant's plan became visible to me in that moment, the way a building's skeleton becomes visible when you strip away the drywall. The offers were pressure. The arsenic was intimidation. The brake lines were desperation. But the conservatorship petition, that was the real weapon. A piece of paper that could undo everything Dorothy had built. I opened letter 9 from the USB drive on the bunker's mounted screen. Dorothy's voice filled the concrete chamber. Calm and clear, and utterly without fear. "Russell, if you have found this room, then you know the full scope of what Grant has done. Letters 10, 11, and 12 will give you the sequence. Do not skip ahead. Do not act on anger. The evidence must be presented in a specific order to prevent Pinnacle's attorneys from isolating any single piece and discrediting it. Tommy will know the order. Trust him the way you trusted me." Letter 10 described the chain of custody for the internal Pinnacle, reports how Dorothy had obtained them through a whistleblower inside Pinnacle's Knoxville office, who had since relocated under a new identity. Letter 11 contained a list of 14 current and former Pinnacle employees willing to testify under federal subpoena, with contact information stored on an encrypted partition of the USB drive. Letter 12 was addressed to Nora. I did not play it. Not yet. Not without asking her. I climbed out of the bunker into the great room where the afternoon light fell through the tall windows in long gold columns. The hearthstones lay scattered across the floor like the ruins of a promise that no longer needed to be kept. Carrillo followed me up and closed the hatch. "We have enough," he said. "But enough isn't safe. Enough gets plea bargained down to a fine and a suspended sentence. What I need is Grant Mercer on record, in his own voice, admitting what he authorized. The recording Nora provided is 14 months old. A defense attorney will argue coercion, editing, context." He paused. "I need something current, something undeniable." "You need bait," I said. Carrillo did not deny it. The plan was simple in the way that dangerous things often are. Carrillo laid it out on the kitchen table using a topographic map, a red marker, and the calm, unblinking delivery of a man who had spent 20 years building cases against people who believed they were untouchable. Russell would contact Grant directly. He would request a meeting at a neutral location, a public diner in Gatlinburg, visible through plate glass windows from the street. And he would make Grant an offer that no amount of legal discipline could prevent the man from responding to. You're going to tell him you know the land is worth 45 million, Carrillo said. You're going to tell him you're willing to negotiate, and you're going to let him believe he's winning. And if he doesn't talk, he'll talk. Men like Grant don't stay quiet when they think they've broken someone. They explain. They justify. They need you to understand that what they did was rational. Carrillo tapped the map. That's the confession. Not guilt. Rationality. Wade objected. He stood by the window, with his arms folded across his chest, and said what any son would say. That his 66-year-old father, who had survived arsenic poisoning and a sabotage truck in the span of 10 days, should not be sitting across a table from the man responsible for both. He's right, Nora said quietly from the hallway. Grant is more dangerous when he thinks he's in control. That's exactly why it has to be Russell, Carrillo said. Grant doesn't respect anyone else in this room. He sees Wade as an academic. He sees Earl as furniture. He sees Nora as property. The only person Grant Mercer has ever considered a genuine obstacle is the man Dorothy trusted enough to leave everything to. I looked at my son. I've walked into burning test chambers at NASA with less preparation than this. I'll be fine. Wade did not look convinced, but he stopped arguing. The morning of the meeting, Carrillo taped a wire to my chest in the lodge bathroom. The device was small, a flat transmitter, no larger than a postage stamp, secured beneath my undershirt with medical adhesive. The receiver sat in an unmarked van that Dawkins had borrowed from the Blount County Sheriff's Department and parked in an alley behind the Gatlinburg Griddle, a breakfast restaurant on the main tourist strip with wide windows, strong coffee, and exactly the kind of public visibility that made violence impractical. I arrived first. I chose the booth nearest the front window, ordered black coffee, and set a manila envelope on the table in plain view. Inside the envelope was a single-page summary of the 3 independent appraisals valuing the property at $45 million, a number Grant had never seen, because Dorothy had never allowed it to exist on any document he could access. Grant walked in at 8:17. He was alone. No attorney. No briefcase. No Nora. He wore a gray suit without a tie, and his face carried the particular stillness of a man who had rehearsed his composure in a mirror. He slid into the booth across from me and glanced at the envelope. "You wanted to talk," he said. "I did. I'm listening." I pushed the envelope across the table. Grant opened it, scanned the appraisal summary, and went still. Not frozen, calculated. I watched his jaw tighten, release, and tighten again as the number registered. 45 million, he said. 45 million. Senior water rights, conservation easement, timber, mineral, and an endangered species habitat corridor that makes the land essentially undevelopable under federal law. I sipped my coffee. Your $32 million offer wasn't generous, Grant. It was theft. His eyes lifted from the page. Something shifted behind them. Not anger, not fear, but the rapid mechanical recalculation of a man whose spreadsheet had just been invalidated. "The trust is irrevocable," he said carefully. "You can't sell it regardless." "No, I can't. But I can designate a successor trustee, someone who manages the property after I'm gone." I paused long enough for the implication to settle. I was considering Wade. But Wade is a scientist. He doesn't understand leverage the way you do. Grant set the appraisal down. His fingers were steady, but a single vein on his left temple pulsed at a rhythm that betrayed his surface calm. "What are you proposing?" "A partnership. You drop the conservatorship petition. You dissolve the asset freeze. In return, I name you as contingent successor trustee with a management fee structure tied to the conservation revenue." I kept my voice flat. Transactional. Stripped of every emotion that was screaming beneath it. Dorothy's dead. I'm 66 with a heart that almost stopped 2 weeks ago. This land needs someone who can operate in the real world. Grant studied me for a long time. The diner clattered around us, plates, conversation, a child laughing at the counter, and none of it touched the silence inside our booth. "Why?" he said finally. "You know what I am. I know what you are. But I also know what $45 million can do if it's managed correctly. Dorothy built a fortress. I'm not a soldier. I'm an engineer. I want the structure to survive, and sentiment doesn't maintain structures. Competence does." The compliment landed exactly where I aimed it, in the center of Grant Mercer's boundless belief in his own indispensability. "I need to think about it," he said. "You have 48 hours. After that, I call the Knoxville office of the EPA and let them decide what the property is worth." Grant's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. The mention of the EPA was a scalpel. I watched it cut. "Don't threaten me, Russell. I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a window." I held his gaze. The same courtesy nobody gave Dorothy. He left the diner at 8:41 without touching his coffee. I watched his sedan pull out of the parking lot and turn east toward the mountain road that led to Klingman's Dome. Carrillo's voice came through an earpiece I had forgotten I was wearing. "He's heading for the trailhead. He'll call you before sundown. When he does, suggest the summit. Tell him you want to settle this where nobody else can hear." I left a $10 bill on the table and walked into the morning light. The trap was set. Now I had to climb into it. Grant called at 4:17 that afternoon. "Klingman's Dome. Tomorrow, 6 a.m., before the tourists. The observation tower at the top. No greeting. No preamble. Come alone. Fine." He hung up. Carrillo, listening through the van's receiver, was already spreading maps across the kitchen table before I set the phone down. "Sunrise is 6:32, Carrillo said. "He wants 30 minutes of near darkness." He traced the half-mile paved trail from the parking lot to the tower's steep grade. No alternate exits. 2 agents in hiking gear on the trail by 5:15. Dawkins holds the parking lot. Earl positions on the east ridge with binoculars and a radio. Wade and Nora stay at the lodge. And me? You walk up alone. The wire transmits within 400 yards. Your panic phrase is, "Dorothy would have understood." You say those words, "We come in." Before that, you let him talk. I did not sleep that night. Nora had listened to Dorothy's 12th letter, the one addressed to her alone in the bunker that evening. She came up 30 minutes later with red eyes and steady hands and said only, "Mom knew about the baby. She knew before I did." At 4:45 a.m., I drove to the Klingman's Dome parking lot. The mountains were black, against a sky beginning to separate from darkness. A single dark sedan sat at the far end. Grant, early, watching. Carrillo's whisper came through the earpiece. "Agents in position. Signal clean. You're live." The trail was steep and silent. Fog closed behind me like a curtain. The observation tower emerged from the gray, a concrete spiral rising above the tree line like a watchtower for a war never officially declared. Grant leaned against the railing at the top, silhouetted against the first pale seam of light along the eastern ridge. "You came alone," he said. "I said I would. I've thought about the partnership. It's acceptable, but I need the internal reports first. All 15 years. Returned before any paperwork is signed." "Why?" "Those reports are attorney-client privileged. Stolen from Pinnacle's legal archive. Any court would rule them inadmissible. A whistleblower provided them. A whistleblower who violated a non-disclosure agreement." Grant's voice was smooth, entirely without guilt. "Those reports don't prove contamination, Russell. They prove Pinnacle conducted internal monitoring and made operational decisions within the scope of legal counsel. That's compliance. Compliance." I tasted the word. 41 times the federal arsenic limit is compliance? Cost-benefit analysis. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times. In many rooms. To many people. 6.2 million in treatment upgrades to protect a downstream population, generating less than 4 million in annual tax revenue. The math doesn't work. It never worked. There it was. Not a confession wrapped in guilt. A confession wrapped in arithmetic. 12,000 people, I said. 12,000 people who were never going to generate enough economic value to justify the remediation cost. That's not cruelty. That's resource allocation. He stepped closer. Dorothy couldn't accept that. She saw the world in images. I see it in numbers. The numbers were never on her side. Every syllable traveled through the transmitter taped beneath my shirt. And the Eagle Creek pipeline, I said. The increased discharge the month Dorothy was diagnosed. Grant's composure flickered a hairline crack through the mask. Victor made that decision independently. Victor Kane told Nora you authorized it personally. In your dining room. 14 months ago. The crack widened. His knuckles whitened on the railing. Nora is confused. Nora has always been. Nora recorded it, Grant. Silence. The mountains held their breath. The first true sunlight broke across the eastern ridge and struck the tower like a verdict delivered in gold. Grant moved fast. 2 steps. Both hands on my collar. My back driven against the concrete railing. Stone pressed into my spine. Below, the mountainside dropped 800 feet into fog. You're wired, he hissed. His hand tore at my shirt, found the transmitter, ripped it free. He held up the small flat disc trailing a thin wire, and his face went white. Dorothy would have understood, I said. Boots on pavement. Voices calling federal identification. Earl's radio squawking from the ridge. Grant released my collar. His hands fell to his sides. The charcoal suit that had always made him look like the most capable man in any room now hung on him like something borrowed from a larger person. Carrillo reached the platform first, badge raised, 2 agents behind him. Grant Mercer. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate the Safe Drinking Water Act, accessory to negligent homicide, attempted murder, and obstruction of a federal investigation. Grant said nothing. He extended his wrists. The handcuffs closed with a sound that echoed off the concrete and carried down the mountain into the fog, where 12,000 people were waking up to water they did not yet know was poisoned. I leaned against the railing and breathed. The sun cleared the ridge. The Great Smoky Mountains stretched in every direction, patient and indifferent, and older than any crime committed against them. Dorothy's land. Dorothy's water. Dorothy's war. Fought by a man she had loved enough to trust with everything she had built and everything she had hidden. The iron key was still in my pocket. It was warm. The trial began on a Tuesday in October. In a federal courtroom in Knoxville with tall windows that let in the kind of autumn light that makes everything look more honest than it is. I sat in the second row behind the prosecution table. Nora sat beside me. She was 5 months along by then, showing enough that the navy blazer she wore no longer buttoned, and she kept her hands folded across her stomach, the way her mother used to hold a camera, steady, deliberate, protective of something fragile and important. The prosecution's case took 11 days. Carrillo had built it the way Dorothy had built her laboratory, methodically, redundantly, with every piece of evidence cross-referenced against at least 2 independent sources, so that removing any single element would not collapse the structure. The jury heard the summit recording first. Grant's voice filled the courtroom through ceiling-mounted speakers, flat and precise, and completely devoid of the composure he had maintained for 15 years. 6.2 million in treatment upgrades to protect a downstream population, generating less than 4 million in annual tax revenue. The math doesn't work. It never worked. A woman in the jury box closed her eyes. A man in the back row of the gallery stood up and walked out. He was from Millhaven. His daughter had been diagnosed with kidney failure at 19. They heard Nora's recording next. Grant and Victor Kane in the Nashville dining room, 14 months before the arrest. Kane's voice, gravelly and indifferent. If we push the discharge volume up 60% through Eagle Creek, The downstream concentration hits 40 times federal minimum. And Grant's reply, captured with perfect clarity by the phone Nora had hidden behind a stack of cookbooks on the kitchen counter. Do it. Run it for 90 days. If anyone asks, the seasonal flow variance accounts for the spike. Victor Kane had been arrested in Memphis 3 weeks after Grant. He pleaded guilty to 12 counts of illegal discharge under the Clean Water Act and agreed to testify against Grant in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony lasted 2 days. He described the pipeline operation, the falsified discharge reports, and the meeting where Grant instructed him to increase volume after learning that Dorothy had submitted water samples to the EPA. Kane looked at me once during his testimony. I looked back. He was the first to turn away. The defense argued procedural violations chain of custody for the Pinnacle internal reports, the whistleblower's broken non-disclosure agreement, the admissibility of a recording made without Grant's consent in a one-party consent state. The judge overruled each objection with the controlled patience of a man who had read every motion filed by both sides and found only one of them credible. Wade testified on day 7. He stood at the witness stand with a projector remote in his hand and walked the jury through the hydrogeological data. The contamination plume, the aquifer flow patterns, the biological sample results from 431 residents. He showed them what arsenic does to a human kidney over 10 years. He showed them what it does to a child's developing nervous system over 5. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. Martha Calloway testified on day 9. She was 71 years old, 4 feet 11, and spoke with the quiet authority of a woman who had taught 7th grade science for 38 years. She described her grandson's peripheral neuropathy diagnosis. She described the water in Millhaven, how it tasted faintly metallic in the summer, how children stopped drinking from the school fountain years ago because it made their stomachs hurt, how nobody connected the symptoms because nobody told them there was something to connect. We trusted the water, she said. We had no reason not to. The courtroom was silent for 9 seconds after she finished. I counted. On day 14, the jury returned a verdict in 4 hours and 22 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to violate the Safe Drinking Water Act. Accessory to negligent homicide. Attempted murder of Russell Tate. Obstruction of a federal investigation. Destruction of evidence. Fraud. 12 counts total. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. Grant stood in a gray suit, the same color he had worn to every significant moment of his professional life, and said nothing when the judge asked if he wished to address the court. His attorney read a prepared statement about remorse and cooperation that sounded like it had been drafted by a machine trained on the language of men who are sorry they were caught. The judge sentenced Grant Mercer to 52 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for the first 35. He was 44 years old. He would be eligible for parole consideration at 79. Nora did not cry. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach and exhaled, long and slow, the way you breathe when something heavy has been lifted from a place inside you that you had forgotten could be empty. The class action lawsuit was filed the following month. 3 towns, 12,000 plaintiffs, $180 million in damages sought against Pinnacle Industries for 15 years of contaminated water, medical costs, property devaluation, and wrongful death. The case settled before trial for $176 million, distributed across the affected communities through a fund administered by a court-appointed trustee. The EPA designated the Eagle Creek watershed a Superfund site in January federal cleanup priority, mandatory remediation, permanent monitoring. The cost of remediation was estimated at $41 million. Pinnacle Industries' annual revenue, the year the pipeline began operating, had been $900 million. $41 million to clean up what $6.2 million would have prevented. That was Grant Mercer's arithmetic, carried to its conclusion. I drove back to the lodge the evening after the sentencing. The mountain road was clear. The fog had lifted for the first time in weeks, and the ridgeline stood sharp against a winter sky that looked like it had been scrubbed clean. Earl was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. Real coffee, from sealed beans he had ground that morning. poured into ceramic mugs Dorothy had bought at a craft fair in Gatlinburg 8 years ago. "It's over," I said. Earl handed me a mug. "It's not over. It's different. Over is when the water runs clean." He was right. He was always right about the things that mattered. The sign was carved from a single slab of Tennessee white oak by a furniture maker in Piney Creek who refused payment. The letters were deep-cut and blackened with a torch, the way old trail markers were burned into wood so that rain and time could not erase them. The Dorothy Tate Water Monitoring Center Est. 1 year after the silence broke. Clean water is not a privilege. It is a promise. They mounted it on the morning of the anniversary, above the lodge's front door, in the exact spot where Dorothy had hung a photograph of a red-tailed hawk banking over the ridgeline the year she bought the property. Earl held the ladder. Wade drilled the bolts. Nora stood in the gravel driveway, holding a 4-month-old girl, wrapped in a pale green blanket that Martha Calloway had knitted from yarn she purchased at the same craft fair in Gatlinburg, where Dorothy once bought ceramic mugs. The baby's name was Eleanor Dorothy Tate. Nora had dropped the Mercer from her own name 3 months earlier. The divorce papers had been signed without contest from a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and the custody agreement, sole, permanent, unconditional, had been filed the same week. 200 people came to the opening. They drove up the mountain road in pickup trucks and sedans, and a yellow school bus that Martha had convinced the Millhaven district superintendent to loan for the occasion. They parked along the gravel shoulders and walked through the iron gate that I had opened for the first time exactly 1 year ago, not knowing what waited inside. Sheriff Dawkins directed traffic in the parking area. Tommy Carrillo stood near the porch in civilian clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, no badge, looking like a man who had finally set something down that he had been carrying for a very long time. Hank Jessup drove up from his gas station in a truck older than most of the guests and shook my hand without saying a word. He didn't need to. The grip said everything. Wade gave the first remarks. He stood on the porch with a wireless microphone clipped to his collar and spoke about water the way only a hydrologist cannot, as a resource, not as a commodity, but as a continuous, living system that connects every person in a watershed, whether they know it or not. He described the monitoring network Dorothy had designed. 14 permanent testing stations across 3 watersheds, automated sampling every 72 hours, data transmitted in real time to a public dashboard accessible to every resident in Millhaven, Cedar Bluff, and Piney Creek. My mother believed that the most dangerous thing about contaminated water wasn't the poison, Wade said. It was the silence. The years when nobody tested, nobody asked, and nobody told. This center exists to make sure that silence never comes back. Martha Calloway spoke next. She stood at the microphone for a moment without speaking, looking out at the crowd. And then she said, "My grandson can feel his feet again." She paused. "That's all I came to say." She stepped down. The applause lasted longer than her speech. I spoke last. I had written notes on an index card. But when I stood in front of those 200 faces, some familiar, some strange, all of them connected by water they had trusted, and water that had betrayed them, the card stayed in my pocket, next to the iron key. A year ago, I walked into this lodge carrying a key I didn't understand, reading a letter from a woman I thought I knew completely, and discovering that the person I had loved for 34 years had a life I never saw. I was angry. I was confused. I was 66 years old and standing in a secret laboratory behind a dark room, listening to my dead wife's voice explain that the water was poisoned, and the man who poisoned it was married to my daughter. I paused. The crowd was still. Dorothy didn't build this place for me. She didn't build it for the lawsuit or the settlement or the verdict. She built it because she drank a glass of water from the well behind this lodge, tested it on a Tuesday afternoon, and discovered that 12,000 people were being slowly killed by a man who called it resource allocation. I looked at Nora. She was holding Eleanor against her shoulder, one hand cupped behind the baby's head, standing exactly where Dorothy would have stood if the world had been kinder. I am not a scientist. I am not a lawyer. I am a retired engineer who spent 40 years building machines that went to places no human could survive. But the most important thing I ever built was not a machine. It was this. I gestured at the lodge, the sign, the mountains behind it, the people filling the gravel driveway. A promise that the water will be watched, that someone will always test it, that silence is no longer an option. I reached into my pocket and held up the iron key. The same key Pat Langford had pressed into my palm in a Nashville office 1 year ago. The same key that opened the gate, the dark room, the bunker, and every locked truth Dorothy had left behind. This key opened a door I was forbidden to enter. I'm glad I broke that promise. Some promises need to be broken so that better ones can be kept. I set the key on the porch railing. It caught the afternoon light and glowed the color of something that had passed through fire and survived. Earl was the last to find me. After the crowd had eaten and talked and wandered through the lodge and the monitoring lab and the trails that wound through 620 acres of protected watershed, he found me sitting on the back porch, looking at the well where Dorothy had drawn the water that started everything. You know what she would have said, he told me. What? She would have said you took too long. I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in that place, a real laugh, the kind that starts deep and doesn't ask permission. From somewhere down in the valley, carried on the wind through ancient spruce and across water that was finally, slowly, beginning to run clean, I heard a sound. A single, sustained tone, high and clear. It could have been a bird. It could have been the wind through a gap in the ridgeline. It could have been nothing at all. But to me, it sounded exactly like 440 hertz, the frequency of a fire alarm in a NASA testing chamber in 1989. The sound that cleared a room and saved 2 lives. The sound that became a password, that became a door, that became a promise kept by a woman who loved me enough to hide an entire world inside a mountain and trust that I would find it. The sound that saved us both.